Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of Theology and Rob. My guest today is Dr. Ben Norquist, who is the director of the Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East, or NEME, as it often goes by. Ben is a researcher and a public organizer who's been following and researching the events in Israel-Palestine for over 25 years, including he did a PhD at Azusa Pacific and wrote his PhD dissertation on higher education in the land of Palestine. Ben has I've gotten to know him over the last several months, and he's just got a thorough knowledge of the history and politics of Israel-Palestine. But Ben is a capital E evangelical Christian. So his focus is always ultimately on, a gospel-centered approach to peace in the Middle East, not simply understanding the political situation for politics sake. Anyway, he's the co-author of a forthcoming book called Every Somewhere Sacred, Rescuing a Theology of Place in the American Imagination, coming out with IVP Academic in 2025. Ben will also be leading a breakout at the Exiles Conference alongside Munther Isaac and Soon Chan Ra. He told me the other day, he's like, is it okay if Soon Chan Ra joins me in the breakout? I'm like, what? We got Soon Chan Ra? He's done lots of amazing work as well. So you're not, well, this is a tough thing. Like, I want to say you're not going to want to miss the breakout. The only reason why I hesitate is there's a few other breakouts that I also think you're not going to want to miss. So, you'll just have to choose wisely. I wish I could be at all three of these, or all four. I think we have 4 breakouts. Anyway, if you want to register for the Exiles in Babylon conference and hang out with people like Ben and others and myself, theologyandrod.com. All the information is there. April 3rd to 5th. It's right around the corner in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I just absolutely cannot wait. It's my favorite time of the year with when so many awesome people gather together at Exiles. Okay, this conversation, we do talk all about history, politics of Israel-Palestine. I know I've had on several guests to address this as well. And what I love about Ben is, man, just he's so gracious and so thorough in his understanding, and has just been in this conversation for so long with this really robust gospel-centered focus. So, we mix it up a bit. So excited for you to join us. Welcome. Please welcome to the show. Sorry, I'm fumbling around. Please welcome to the show for the first time, the one and only Dr. Ben Norquist. Ben, thanks so much for being on Theology Raw, man. It's been good getting to know you over the last several months. You've been a huge help to my own thinking in so many ways, and excited to have you on the show, man.
Thanks, Preston. It's a joy and honor to be here, and really appreciate our conversations. And I've been learning a lot from you too. So good stuff.
So you founded and are, what's your title? The president of the Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East?
I am the director. I'm not a founder. So this thing has had some life before I came to it. But I'm the director of the Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East, or NEME as we call it.
NEME, yeah.
Yep.
So what led you to want to be a part of this? I mean, there's got to be a backstory here.
Yeah, for sure. So NEME is kind of motley crew. We call it a network of everyday Christians and pastors and artists and researchers. All of us evangelicals, we're at least kind of at a theological perspective, and kind of our cultural identity identifies evangelicals, if not politically. That term has baggage.
I was going to say the term probably needs to be defined. I'm assuming it's to separate NEME from maybe a much more progressive liberal branch of Christianity that maybe share some of the same passions and concerns, but you're doing so from a theologically
conservative place. Evangelical place. That's right. Yeah. And we're concerned, I would say, with the way that the evangelical church in the United States has engaged with and narrated about the Israel-Palestine conflict broadly, and especially about Gaza. In the last year and a half, it's been deeply concerning, the kinds of truths that our fellow evangelicals in the United States have been willing to acknowledge or not acknowledge about what's been happening there. But so for like kind of personally, I came to this work after doing a PhD in higher education, and studied the Palestinian higher education system.
That was your PhD.
That was my dissertation. Yeah. So
the Palestinian education. Wow.
Okay. Higher education. So it was a case study about a regional case study about Palestinian higher education in Bethlehem.
This is funny because we're talking offline about Palestinians in education, high value. I didn't realize this is your dissertation.
Yeah. I'm speaking out of that background.
So give us a short snapshot. Why would you want to study that, and what did you find in your dissertation work?
For sure. Yeah. So, well, I mean, just at kind of a practical level, when I was picking my topic and my question, this topic sits at the intersection of two things that I'm passionate about: education and Palestine. And so it fit from that perspective, but kind of digging into some of the substance, I was really interested in how higher education, we all kind of have in our heads what it's about, what it's for. We've conceptualized this thing called higher education. How does that change under the really very different conditions under which Palestinians live? Conditions of a military occupation in the West Bank. Palestinians live in lots of different places. There are Palestinian citizens of Israel. There's a global diaspora, but thinking specifically of Palestinians who are in the West Bank, which Israel militarily controls, and in which there's this pretty aggressive settlement movement of Israelis who are coming in and setting up life inside of the West Bank. And it creates a lot of tension and pressure for Palestinians who live there. So I was asking, what do those conditions, what does that context mean for how Palestinian educators and learners go about their work as educators and learners? It was a life-changing project. That was a few years ago. Even before that, I grew up in an evangelical home and community and churches, and we were, I would say, nominally Christian Zionists. So it was not a big part of how we talked about our faith. But when Israel and or Palestine was in the news, then it would come up. That would trigger conversations, sermons, things like that. I remember when I was 10 or 11 years old in the 90s, this was the era of Oslo. My Sunday school teachers taught us all to fold paper cranes, like origami cranes. These birds are a symbol of peace. And they had us folding these during the lesson every week, all year long, until we had thousands of them. And then we put them all together into this chandelier. And my church sent that chandelier as a gift to the Israeli embassy. So it was definitely in the air.
Wow. Yeah.
And then when I was 25, maybe 26, I heard someone tell a story about a little Palestinian girl, 9 or 10 years old, who was walking home from school one day in her Palestinian village in the West Bank. And a soldier, not a Palestinian soldier, a foreign soldier from somewhere nearby, probably 18, 19 years old, an Israeli soldier who was there as a part of the military occupation of the West Bank, fired a rubber bullet, and it struck her in the back of the head and killed her. And I remember hearing that story, and it gripped me, not necessarily because of the injustice of it or the tragedy of it, although that was certainly there. It was that I thought of myself as knowing a thing or two about this part of the world, having grown up in a context that paid a lot of attention to the Holy Land, both the kind of biblical history of it and the modern. We sent a chandelier to the Israeli embassy because we were excited about the idea of peace in the land. So I thought I knew, and then I heard this story about this girl, and I realized it was the very first time I had ever heard a story in my life about a Palestinian who was named and humanized. And it made me wonder, like, why have I never heard this story or this kind of story in my 25 years of really intense study about the Holy Land? And it set me on a kind of journey. That was 25 years ago.
Wow, golly. And since then you have, is it been like you've been following all the events that have unfolded over the last 25 years? And I assume you've been over to Israel-Palestine.
Yeah.
Several times.
I didn't get to Israel-Palestine until I started my doctorate, my dissertation. Okay. And that's, so my trips over there have largely been for research purposes. Okay. But then just this last year, I started working with the Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East, and so now my travel pertains to that work. Okay. But yeah.
What tell us about the work of NIMI? Like, what is it? What's your 9 to 5? What projects do you guys do? What are you working on? I know you guys are really good. I mean, I'm just hearing about the story that affected you so much, and we've all had stories affect us, and you guys are so good at telling stories. Tell us about the reason behind that?
Yeah. So NEME exists to help evangelicals, American evangelicals like us, approach this topic more holistically and with a deeper roots in the ground of reality. We look out at the way that kind of the American evangelical church has engaged with Israel-Palestine in recent decades, and are concerned about the level of influence that American evangelicals have over the lives of real people who they, the vast majority will never meet, in the Middle East, in the Holy Land. And, at different levels. That influence is at the governmental level. We have really powerful evangelicals making decisions on U.S. policy that affects the United States' relationship to what's going on over there. Guys like Mike Huckabee and Mike Pence before him, and a lot of friends of evangelicals too, like Marco Rubio and Elise Stefanik, who have said things like, Palestinians don't exist, and there's no such thing as an occupation, and who are making these statements that are really inflammatory some of the time. The money that we send as a church, above and beyond the billions of dollars every year of our tax dollars that go to Israel, the evangelical church in the United States also sends millions of dollars voluntarily to Israel, and maybe even more kind of concerning, to Israeli settlements. And there's, a kind of cottage industry of evangelical groups going over to volunteer their labor in Israeli settlements in the West Bank as well. And then the moral support that we offer as a church to in problematic ways, to injustice that's happening there. So that's kind of what is concerning us. And we, so our work, to get back to your question, is to help American evangelicals as evangelicals, not compromising our theological convictions, but really like returning to them, and asking, what does a Christ-centered, gospel-centered life and approach to Israel-Palestine, what should it look like? Because we don't think that what we have right now is that.
Can we Yeah, I want to back up real quick and just maybe open up some of these terms you've used for somebody that may not know the full significance of them. So settlements and occupation. It actually took me a
Okay.
while to really get. I had to read a lot of history. I'm like, oh, okay, so that's why this is really profoundly problematic. I this is how I found out a few weeks ago that I actually stayed in a settlement during the Second Intifada.
Isn't that funny?
I
mean, it's
I
not
didn't
funny,
know.
but
I didn't even know what a settlement was. I didn't know if I was in the West Bank or in Israel. I didn't know anything. I didn't even know that we were in the middle of the Second Intifada. It was just a neighborhood. Just stay there. I had some relatives actually that lived there. And I just found out that I'm like, where was that place that we stayed? I looked at the map. I'm like, oh, and so the line. I'm like, wait, that was a
It's in the West
Jewish
Bank.
neighborhood. It was beautiful. I mean, all this stone and beautiful. And I looked, and it's like, well, that's in the West Bank. I'm like, wait, it was a large Jewish neighborhood in the West
Yeah,
Bank. That is
yeah.
settlement, right?
Yep.
I mean,
Yeah, totally.
So it's just, I mean, there's you can go to Israel-Palestine and be so just shielded from any kind of alternative.
Yep.
Like from the trying to let me use neutral terms, from some of the deep complexities
Totally.
that exist in the land. I lived for 4 months outside of Abu Ghosh, which was a Palestinian village in Israel, not Palestine. And I didn't realize that the hill I used to wake up and look at was right where the border was in the West
on the
Bank.
other side.
That on the other side. Now this is 1999, so there was the wall was actually not up, you know. So and that was, you know, between the two intifadas. So it was a relatively peaceful time. This is the fall of 99, a year before the whole incident on the Temple Mount with Ariel Sharon. Anyway, so for somebody that can you give us just a quick background of what are settlements, what is this occupation, and why are these? Because you've hinted that these are very problematic.
Yeah. Well, so I'm happy to do that. Before I do, you mentioned that you could be in the land and not have any clue about some of these things. Some of that is intentional, and I like to. I often when I'm in the land and I'm like, you know, we're talking about this particular thing with people. I think of the Truman Show. Have you ever seen that? Yeah. It's like this constructed world that's not real, you know, but it presents itself as such. You know, the way that roads are laid out so that you see some things and not other things. You know, the way that communities are structured so that you see some of them and don't see others is a part of the way that the story is told, you know, and constructed. But so occupation, if you go back to 1967, and you know what we call the 6 Days War, Israel conquered the West Bank and Gaza and several other territories as well. And they gave the Sinai back to Egypt. They've legally, you know, according to their own rules, annexed the Golan Heights, and they've militarily stayed in the West Bank, and until a while ago, Gaza as well. Then they withdrew from Gaza and set up a perimeter. But so occupation just refers to the continued military control of those territories that they conquered in 1967. Settlement is above.
Now, somebody could say, and I'm going to try to represent kind of a pushback on the other side as best as I can and fairly as I can. They could say, well, I mean, that 6 Days War was started by several Arab countries, and they conquered these territories because these were hotbeds of terrorism, and they had to control these territories. and they conquered it. It was war. They conquered it. I mean,
Right.
America conquered, we conquered California and, or whatever. I don't even know if that's true, but that's just what happens. Like when people fight against you, you fight back and you win and you get the territory. And especially if they keep shooting rockets at you all the time, like, yeah, we need to have military presence here so you don't keep killing us.
Yeah.
Is that a good representation of?
Yeah. Oh, I hear that all the time. Yeah. I mean, I guess what I would say though is, that kind of a response is getting a little bit beyond a kind of definitions of terms and facts. Okay. Even someone who might say that could or should at least be able to agree that what is happening is an occupation. They might feel so the need to say, yeah, but the occupation is justified.
Okay, that's it. Okay. So nobody disagrees that it's an occupation.
Yeah, there should be very little disagreement about that. That's pretty factual, and it's defined legally and all of that. Now there are, I should say, there are people out there who even will like disagree with the legal definition of an occupation, and so they'll say no, this is not a military occupation. But 99% of the world's countries consider this to be an occupation and whatever else. So, So yeah, that's kind of occupation. And like it from the ground, what that looks like is Palestinians who have lived in, who are living in the West Bank. When they go from one town to another, they have to use roads that Israeli soldiers stand at, and they walk through they have to go through the checkpoints. And if, Palestinians are subject to being detained by the Israeli military, and then they're subject to Israeli military courts. Those are facts on the ground. That's there's no dispute about that, and that's what I mean when I say military occupation.
Oh, okay.
Settlement is beyond that. So if a military occupation is kind of the military control of a territory, you could do lots of different things with that territory. One of the things that has been happening since almost day one of the military occupation of the West Bank is Israeli civilians have been moving into the West Bank to live there. And that also is not, that's just factual. That's, you can argue about whether that should be happening or whether it's permissible to be happening, if it's moral or legal or whatever. And those conversations are out there. But the fact remains that, there are hundreds of thousands now of Israeli civilians who have moved into the West Bank and are setting up these neighborhoods and communities, one of which you stayed in. A lot of them are kind of arrayed around the Jerusalem metro area. And then there are others that are like on hilltops throughout the West Bank, and connected to Israel by roads, some of which only Israelis are allowed to use. And some of them are actually inserted right inside of Palestinian cities and towns like Hebron. There's an Israeli settlement presence in the Palestinian city of Hebron as well, which is why Hebron is one of the most violent, high tension places in the West Bank. So. Right. So just to answer your question, that would be what the settlement of the West Bank is. Yeah.
Now, is that illegal, or why is that just what I asked? What might seem like a dumb question.
It is.
Like, why is that wrong? Like Palestinians 20% of Israel or people live in Israel, Palestinian, right? So yeah, Palestinians can live in Israel. Why can't Israelis live in Palestine?
Yeah. So Palestinians who are Israeli citizens can live in Israel. Palestinians in the West Bank cannot move into Israel.
Okay.
They have to fight really hard to even be able to visit family in Israel or religious sites in Israel or whatever. But yeah, so I mean, on a legal perspective, moving a civilian population into an occupied territory is illegal. So a lot of
like
the
international
legal,
law or something.
International law, a lot of the those conversations are like legal conversations revolve around that. And then there's just the moral question of like what is the human result of this settlement of the West Bank, and it's a lot of bloodshed at the end of the day. It's a lot of tension that results from Israeli civilians moving into the West Bank and taking people's land, taking people's space. I don't know if you've been, it's like this documentary that just came out, hasn't been distributed widely in the US yet. No Other Land is all about that, about this Masafer Yatta Palestinian area in the southern West Bank where Israel has been pushing to get to displace them off their family land, and people are dying. People are being shot and killed.
Yeah, there's a lot of and I don't know the statistics. I probably have them written down somewhere. Of just settler violence, like these. I don't want to say every single settler is violent, or even most of them are violent, but does seem to be a kind of an aggressive spirit that underlies somebody who would go and move. Like there's a statement being made. We're going to go and move into this land that belongs to us, and we might even take over. It might have previously belonged to Palestinians, and we're going to grab the land. It's not like they're coming in with a peaceful spirit, right? I mean, is that fair to say? Is that too big of a generalization? Or I mean, I've seen, you can go online and just see, settler violence. I mean, it's seems to be pretty common.
Israeli society is a complex society, and so you've got all sorts. And that should go without saying, of course, like people who believe in the image of God and the preciousness of all people, God came and died for the whole world, should with just a little bit of reflection realize all societies are complex societies, and we do an injustice to them and even to our evangelical convictions when we reduce them to one thing. And that is part of what's been so concerning to NIMI, is that we as American evangelicals, when we look at this complexity over here, we reduce it so that we can wrap our heads around it and understand it and feel less morally disturbed. And even we reduce it in order to take sides too. So a lot of what we've been doing at NEME over the last year and a half is we've been listening really carefully to what our brothers and sisters here in the U.S. say about Israel and Palestine. What we're observing is this reduction of complexity and detail into partisan stories.
Can you unpack that? I would love for you to unpack. You this has been your full-time job, paying attention to the stories being told.
Yeah.
How would you unpack the story that has been told to and from the evangelical church in America, let's just say since October 7th?
Yeah. So we've been listening across kind of different swaths of evangelicals and where they are in society. At the level of government, I mentioned Huckabee and Pence and that kind of cast of folks, and the kinds of things that they say. Like there's no such thing as a Palestinian. Huckabee also a few years ago said, this is not between, right or left. This is between heaven and hell, good and evil. The Israelis represent heaven, in that scenario, for Huckabee. So at the governmental level, then you've got kind of organizations and influencers. And this is where Christianity Today has done a lot of writing and they've produced whole podcasts about, kind of telling their their take on what's happening in Gaza. Russell Moore, within the editor-in-chief of Christianity Today, within the first couple days, I think, published an article calling for moral clarity and for American Christians to stand with Israel. And Mike Cosper wrote, who's also at CT, wrote several articles and produced a whole limited series podcast. Kind of tell with his take, his version of the story. And David French, who's an evangelical and now a columnist for New York Times, has been out there. Richard Land, the executive editor of the Christian Post, called this conflict a clash between civilization and barbarism. So you've got that whole tier, and then you've got the level of individuals and churches at a kind of congregational level. Many of whom, I'll say, at least for churches and pastors, many of whom, not all, but many, prayed for Israel after October 7th, as they should, appropriately so. But then have been silent since then, and, for various reasons, avoiding the topic that feels too complicated or like, a live wire. Like if you touch this, it's going to, you're going to lose people at your church. So that's what we've been noticing and listening to that whole kind of group across those different tiers. And what is the story that we've been hearing? What's coming out from those places? And there are some kind of high level themes that we've been noticing. One of them I mentioned is this kind of story, this account of Israel and Palestine that is oversimplified and flattened. And in particular, the roles that different groups play in this story are kind of have become predictable. Almost like kind of the cowboy and Indians. Like as soon as when I was growing up, if there was a cowboy and Indian story on TV, I knew before I even turned the TV on, who the good guys were.
Yeah.
And we can recognize that that's like a cultural mythology that is so oversimplified that it doesn't correspond any longer to reality. That's and something similar is happening with the way that American evangelicals have been talking about this. It's like a cowboy and Indian story. Palestinian absence among the narrators. So the Cosper's podcast called Promised Land, six episode series. He interviewed a lot of different people for that and includes snippets from those interviews. Depending on how you count, 14, 15, maybe 16 different people that he interviewed. 4 of them were Palestinians. And all 4 of those Palestinians appeared in one single episode. Throughout the rest of the series, whenever Palestinians came up, Palestinian history, people were characterizing Palestinians, it was non-Palestinians talking about them. And that's kind of a case in point of a larger pattern that we saw, across these different media. So,
and if I recall correctly, it's been a while since I listened to it. The 4 conversations with the 4 Palestinians was very clearly had a I don't want to say combative. It wasn't combative. He was listening and trying to understand, but it was very much, he would kind of push back and question and then give his own kind of response. You get the audio of him talking to the Palestinian, and then he kind of records later, his kind of thoughts on it. So it definitely had a very adverse tone to it, whereas his conversations with all the Israelis was just whatever they said was never questioned. It was framed as here's the true story,
Yeah, the what I found to be kind of problematic, well, not kind of, quite problematic, was, I mean, you're getting to it here. Like, first of all, for like his willingness to allow all, like, so much characterization of the Palestinian story by non-Palestinians.
Mhm.
And then he grouped all of the Palestinians into one episode. And actually I would use the word combative with, at least with regard to a few of those interviews. He was combative with them, actively challenging things that they said. And then you're right. It was like, it wasn't like that with the other interview subjects, but what I like to compare is his interviews with the settler. He interviews an Israeli settler, and he's joking around. He's chummy. The settler says some deeply problematic things, like very racist, violent things. And those go unchallenged. So that is an example of what we're noticing when we talk about Palestinian absence from among the narrators of these stories. American evangelicals are inviting Israelis to collaborate with them in telling the story. So Israelis, Jewish folks, like, there are a lot of Israeli narrators in American evangelical storytelling about Israel-Palestine. There are fewer Palestinians in those places.
And the storytelling, you know way more about this than I do. But I read John Mersheimer's book, The Israel Lobby, who, it's got over 1,000 footnotes. He's a professor at University of Chicago, just one of the experts in foreign policy. Brilliant. I mean, some people like, oh, he's wrong, he's terrible, how can you cite John Murray? But it's like, you just show me the evidence. I remember I posted that book. It's a really one of the most thoroughly researched, documented books, just showing how much money and power is behind so many things, with regard to Israel and America and the connection there. I mean, deep, I would say pretty dark things, but specifically the money and power behind telling the narrative.
Right.
The narrative
Yes.
is a very, very well funded
the
narrative, and alternative narratives are also funded to not be told.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so the kind of fancy academic word that I've used to talk about this in the past is that it's not just a conflict of physical force. It's an epistemological conflict as well. For hearts and minds, over understanding. How will this conflict be understood? How it will be framed? And as we've been thinking about that very question, we actually, like, distilled down the story behind these stories, the kind of meta narrative that seems to be animating a lot of these podcasts and articles that we've been reading. And I wrote it down. It fits in 3 paragraphs. Can I read it to you?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Okay. The conflict is religiously based and ancient. The history of the Jews is one of suffering and victimization, and Israel is threatened on all sides by hostile neighbors, and Palestinians have rejected every offer for peace. In fact, Palestinians teach their children to hate Jews and Israel from an early age. So, while Israeli society is fundamentally virtuous, democratic, Palestinians, unfortunately, are basically violent as they grow up in a culture of violence. So what else should Israel do than to maximize its military power and maintain control over the Palestinian people and land for its own safety? After all, God brought Israel back to the land after 2,000 years in exile, fulfilling land promises and prophecy from the Old Testament. According to those promises from God, the whole land belongs to Israel. And God will bless our country if we stand with Israel, and curse us if we don't. Indeed, God is planning for the state of Israel to play a significant role in his plans for the redemption of the world in the end times. On October 7th, the evil that was allowed to grow in Gaza broke out. Since then, the tunnels have forced Israel's hand, regrettably leading to too many civilian deaths. But this is actually their fault. They elected Hamas after all. And Hamas is fundamentally dedicated to destroying Israel and the Jews wherever they are in the world. That is the cowboy and Indian story that sits behind so much of what we have interacted with and read over the last year and a half from American evangelicals.
I meet so many people who don't feel fulfilled in their current stage of life, but they struggle to make a change because they're just unsure of where to start and who to trust. If this is you, then I highly encourage you to check out an awesome opportunity for you to give the gift of English to the next generation of students in amazing places like Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa. So for over 40 years, an organization called the English Language Institute in China, or ELIC, and it's not just in China anymore, ELIC has helped thousands of people like you take a leap of faith to live a purposeful life by teaching English and bringing hope to communities that don't have access to the gospel. ELIC teachers provide locals with quality English education. They build organic relationships with students, colleagues, and neighbors in the process. They have 3 unique ways to get involved. Summer English camps, which last just 2 to 4 weeks, or a 9-month professional and personal development program for recent college grads, and a year or more of teaching placement in one of the 12 countries that they serve. So if you have a heart for reaching the nations, teaching or leading them, then you need to check out ELIC. You don't need an English or teaching degree to go. ELIC will train you, whatever experience you do or don't have. Just go to elic.org/TITR. That's elic.org/TITR to learn more. I mean, you're obviously, people can sense that you disagree with that narrative, probably on so many levels. What's wrong with that?
What's wrong with
narrative?
Yeah. So the main problem is what it omits.
Okay.
There's a lot in there that has kind of echoes of truth.
Okay.
The second
like
line
in a cowboy and Indian story, you can tell a cowboy and Indian, like, my fellow cowboy was scalped by this violent Indian in this village, and they raided our whatever. Like, there's without talking about, we took over their land and committed genocide on their people. Yeah.
So much of what's in there, on its face, there's a lot of truth to it. But you can tell a lie through omission. Of course, you can mislead through omission. So that's the main problem. That's the main problem. So, what it does is it's selective about what reality to pay attention to. And so at NIMI, what we're trying to do is help evangelicals realize, this is such an incomplete story that we're buying into, realizing that it's a powerful story. We love cowboy and Indian stories. They help us feel comfortable about the world and about being on the right side. But actually, stories that are that distilled and partisan are a part of the problem. Mm-hmm. It's why so much effort and money is spent on storytelling, on framing up in people's minds what is going on, because of how powerful those stories are. But like I said, they reduce they ignore so much of reality. And like, so here are some of the things that are a part of the wider world of Israel-Palestine that don't fit into this story. Okay. So we'll call these counter stories. Okay. The very first line of that mythology that I just told is that it's an ancient conflict.
Right.
So, but the relationship between the Jewish minority in that part of the world and the Arab majority, until the British Mandate, until, the Ottoman Empire fell apart, and after World War I, the British came in and started executing or implementing the policies around the Balfour Declaration. Until that point, those two communities did not have anything like the relationship that they have today of
like
violence,
they got along
conflicts, and oppression.
More or less fine?
Yes. And it's not that those identities were meaningless. It's just that they meant something different. And there were other identities that they shared in common that in many contexts were more important to them than the differences between those identities. For example, their relationship to their colonial power, the Ottomans, foreign power that was dominating both of those communities in common. And so that identity as local residents versus foreign oppressors was more salient in many contexts than the differences that they had between each other. All that changed with the British Mandate. When the British came in and started implementing the policies of the Balfour Declaration, the Jewish community was being systematically empowered for this land to become a homeland. Immigration was being facilitated by the Brits in the first decade of that. And so then all of a sudden that difference became salient and quickly became salient with violent consequences. So that's a story that doesn't fit the mythology. What else? I guess what I'll say is there are a whole range of stories within these two insights. The insight that Israeli society is complex, and the insight that Palestinian society is complex. And this mythology that basically actually says, no, Israeli society is not complex. It's basically virtuous. And Palestinian society is not complex. It's basically vicious. Is challenged as soon as you start seeing Israeli cruelty. And as soon as you start seeing Palestinian virtue. And I could tell countless stories of both. I guess, I don't know if you want to get into specific examples or not, but
yeah, sure, a couple.
Okay. So Israeli cruelty is a reality in this world. And that's not to say Israel is a cruel country. It's not to like let the pendulum swing the other direction and say, Israel is not complex. It's basically vicious. But it's to recognize that there are really vicious elements within this complex Israeli society that are allowed to kind of run amok. You were hinting at some of them among the especially more radical settlers, some of whom were systematically stopping and attacking aid trucks before they got into Gaza. Trucks that were bringing blankets and food and medicine to Gaza. Israeli settlers just ransacking them.
And there's video footage of that. You can see it's pretty easy to find. I remember watching that.
Totally. Right now there's there are some soldiers from the Stay Taman military prison where a lot of prisoners from Gaza were taken, and detainees, and they're currently being prosecuted because, and sorry about this, is not family friendly, but because of a rape that they raped a detainee, and there's footage of this too. This is actually why they're being prosecuted, because they're dead to rights, but I bring that up to say that's not the only testimony I've heard of Palestinians being raped in Israeli prisons by Israeli guards. It is a theme. It's a pattern. I guess maybe last story. There's so many that need to be told, and that as difficult as it is, the one-dimensional picture that we have of Israel needs to be challenged, among American evangelicals. But I'll just tell the story of Hind Rajab. She was a 6-year-old. I think of Abir Aramin, the girl whose story I heard when I was 25. When I hear Hind's story, she was her family was from Gaza City, from the north. And they were trying to comply with an Israeli directive to evacuate. And so her parents put her into a car with her aunt and uncle and 3 cousins. And they were trying to comply with these instructions. But en route, an Israeli tank opened fire on their car and killed Hind's aunt and uncle and 2 of her cousins immediately. And her last remaining relative alive in that car with her, 15-year-old cousin, called the Red Crescent Society to plead with them to send an ambulance to take them away. And the dispatcher, that was common practice, as I understand it, was that in these kinds of situations, the Red Crescent Society would collaborate with the IDF, coordinate with them in order to send an ambulance somewhere and take them. But this older cousin was then shot and killed as well. So here was this 6-year-old girl, Hind, in a car surrounded by the bodies of her relatives. She found the phone on the floor, and there is a recording of her, a 3-hour recording of this 6-year-old girl pleading with the dispatcher to send someone to take her, and that she was so scared. And the Red Crescent Society was able to get through to the IDF. They finally had approval from the IDF to send an ambulance, but when it was about a block away, Israel bombed it and killed the 2 medics inside. And it wasn't until several days later, 2 weeks later, that Hind's relatives were able to make it to that car, and Hind was killed as well. With the last 3 hours of her life were terrifying. And that story is also common. The story of Palestinians in Gaza who were trying to comply with instructions, who were shot and killed along the way, is also I can't tell you how many of those stories I've heard. So that's one side of this picture. Another side of Israeli society that we also don't hear about a lot is the minority within Israeli society, but really compelling minority of Israeli human rights champions for Palestinians who are Israelis. And we don't hear a lot of those stories as well. That's a part of the complexity that we should come to appreciate. And then kind of the last piece that I just want to introduce of this larger reality that doesn't fit into the myth, is Palestinian virtue. The myth talks about Palestinian terrorism and brutality, which is a part of the truth of Palestinian society. But Palestinian virtue, like our friend Daoud Nasser, who lives in Area C in the West Bank. It's a part that Israel is particularly, working hard to displace Palestinians from. His family farm is there in Area C, and so they've been in court for decades, trying to preserve their property rights to their farm. And he, whenever we visit, he always talks about refusing to be enemies. And he connects that to, he roots that in his Christian faith as a Palestinian Christian. On my last trip, I sat down with a former combatant who is now a peace activist and co-founder of an organization called Combatants for Peace. Palestinian guy, former militant, who is now working with former Israeli soldiers who have also come out of that and who are seeking another better way, realizing the impotence of violence to solve these problems.
There is an irony to the clash of narratives when you think about, and I think you can verify this, that among the fairly large Christian population among Palestinians, nonviolence is it's one of the most non-violent branches of Christianity I've ever seen. I mean, it's kind of built into the gospel ethos of Palestinian Christians.
It is.
It's just,
I have learned so much about nonviolence from Palestinian Christians.
The irony that the narrative that American evangelicals have largely believed, and American evangelicals can and I'm trying to speak objectively. If you look at global Christianity, among the more violent branch of evangelicalism. Right. And so the narrative that those are barbarians, those are violent people over there. I mean, that's really odd. If somebody was looking on from the outside, like, wait a minute, here's a bunch of largely oppressed Christians who are your family, by the way, yep. who are responding to nonviolence. You guys over here are, very much just war, or even not even if it's just if it gets the job done. You can look at video footage of Gaza, 80% level, 40, 50, 60,000 people dead. And it's like, well, they started it.
Right.
And we need to get Hamas. So we need to slaughtering women and children to get rid of this evil is a good, this is a good thing. And we can get down the weeds of that, but if you just look objectively at the two different approaches to violence, and yet the one that's way more violent is accusing the other ones of being barbarians, prone to violence. It's just that's just a show. I don't know. When you look at it, it just shows how powerful a narrative can be, that someone would actually frame things in that way.
Yeah, it's a little bit like Truman Show. You live inside of the narrative in your head, and it interprets all data for you. And it's really hard to challenge the reality of it, or to look beyond the set to realize that there's this wider world that has been shielded. You've been shielded from.
Did you see the testimony from the American doctors that were working in Gaza, and the X-rays that they said, and I don't know the number, it was off the I don't know if they said every kid or almost every kid that came in had, sniper bullets to the skull, to their skulls.
That's right.
And so it's one thing. Okay, collateral damage. You're inside a building. they bomb the building because they're trying to get Hamas, and you die because the rubble crushes you.
Right.
But a sniper bullet to the head to a child, not like a 17-year-old, but like a 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 7-year-old, like that's there's no like you're targeting not just civilians.
You targeted a person, right? When you're talking about military marksmen and there's a bullet in someone's head, that was an intentional shot.
And the American doctor said this was pervasive. Like dozens of doctors said this is where we see this like all the time, and they even had like X-rays and stuff showing people.
The other thing that has concerned me, you know, when I think about like here we are followers of the Prince of Peace. So what does that mean for how we understand and interpret and morally evaluate what's happening? What's like the other aspect of the war, you know, in Gaza, that's been deeply concerning to me is the Israeli use of artificial intelligence in creating targeting lists. The level of destruction and of human devastation in Gaza in the last year and a half dwarfs previous incursions into Gaza. And part of the reason for that is the use of AI. It's created an industrial capacity for killing in a short time frame. And we all, you know, when I use ChatGPT, I find 3, 4, 5, 6 mistakes, you know, in the results. When you're talking about using AI to generate targeting lists for killing, that is high stakes. And as an evangelical, I'm you know, we should all be deeply concerned about that.
Isn't one called Daddy's Home? Is that the one of the programs?
And Lavender and one other one. But read more about that on 972 magazine on their website. They have 2 investigative pieces that they did last year and the year before about these AI systems that are just deeply concerning. But the other thing too, that
972 is Israeli too, right? That's not.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's an Israeli source. So if that matters to you, you know, if you feel like you can trust that more for that reason, great. Read 972. And yeah, one of the other things that I've run across as I'm interacting with, you know, my friends and family and evangelicals out there is that they kind of collapse the whole region down into one place. So the kind of logic that they apply to Gaza, because it's a war zone in their minds, they import in their conversations with me about things that are happening in the West Bank as well. And so when someone is targeted by a sniper and shot in the head in the West Bank, they're still thinking of it as like a collateral damage kind of context because of, you know, because it's all a war zone, right? But the West Bank is not the same as Gaza. And so, you know, Shireen Abu Akleh, a Palestinian American journalist who was shot and killed in 2022 in the West Bank by an Israeli sniper while she was wearing her press vest. That there was no like bombing. There was no in the immediate context war going on. She and her colleagues, all of whom were wearing their press vests, were just there, and this sniper shot her, and she. That was a headshot as well. She was killed by a shot to the head by an Israeli sniper. Different context. So be able to parse some of that out would be good as well.
Because I could feel people thinking, Ben and Preston, you're just doing the opposite. You're highlighting singling out the bad things that some Israelis have done, and you haven't even mentioned the hundreds. Over 1,000 people that were brutally slaughtered on October 7th, and all the rocket fire and all the violence on the other side. Like you're just flipping the narrative in the other direction and giving a one-sided picture. Can you speak into that? Is that?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so our encouragement isn't to become partisan on the other side. It's to leave space for a holistic approach that accepts the true things that are true about the current narrative, while adding these other pieces to our understanding.
You're filling out the complexity of both.
Absolutely.
Both sides.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's needed. And, when I think about the Jesus who sat with the Samaritan woman, here is, we follow a Lord and Savior whose world was constructed in a way that he didn't have to do that. And his disciples were surprised that he did, that he would walk through Samaria and sit with this person. So I follow a Lord and Savior who goes out of his way to find the person who's been omitted. To like take the path less traveled in search of the Samaritan women of this world. And for American evangelicals, we should be asking, who are our Samaritan women? And for a lot of us, it's it interacts with the Israel-Palestine conflict in particular ways.
Let's got a few more minutes. Are you okay on time? It's over. It's been over an hour. Yeah, you're good. Let's turn the corner a little bit and focus on, like, what does it look like for a gospel-centered approach to thinking about these things? Because we could get I don't want to diminish at all the political situation and the political history and all these things. But I don't want to, if people said, well, Ben, are you pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli? It sounds like you're pro-Palestinian. Like those, I think people still have those kind of binary categories.
Right.
But as a Christian, right, I mean, we view the world differently than you're on this side and therefore you're against that side.
Yeah.
So help us unpack, like, as you think like a Christian, of how we should think through the situation. What does that look like?
Yeah. So as an evangelical, I am pretty excited about the role of Jesus and the gospel in life and in God's relationship to the world and all of that. One of the things that I think that the gospel does is recapitulate or reemphasize this earlier commitment and insight to the value of humans, created in the image of God. Jesus came to die, for the whole world, and God loves the whole world. So I think it's a very evangelical thing for us to ask, what parts of the world have we been overlooking or ignoring? And that's not to say, Israelis are equally dehumanized by or Jews in particular are equally dehumanized in a lot of the ways that American evangelicals talk about Israel and Palestine. They're also instrumentalized towards this story, flattened out, presented as something less than complex humans, and that's the dehumanization of people, no matter who they are, should be a problem to us as Jesus followers. How does that interface with this particular topic? I think that what it means is that American evangelicals should be making common cause with peacemakers who are Palestinians and Israelis. There are Palestinian peacemakers and there are Israeli peacemakers. Instead of saying I'm pro-Israel or I'm pro-Palestine, which actually just perpetuates the problem, we should be saying I'm pro-peacemaker.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the things that we're trying to do at NIMI.
What I've learned to not call this like a conflict, or even frame it as to. And again, here I am talking about kind of the political situation, but as it, we're not talking about two equal powers.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about a massive power differential. And I don't know. I still think like, how does this factor into? I mean, again, so Israel is the 1,000 times more powerful, right, than any kind of Palestinian resistance. It is the occupying power. It is the funded by several empires. I mean, it's and on it goes. So It's not like, oh, these two people just can't get along. It's like you have a massive power differential, and is that okay? Here's my question: is that important to keep in mind as Christians are seeking to empower peacemaking, or is that a world? Is that a worldly way of looking at it? Because I could see a secular activist really stressing that power differential,
right,
and almost excusing any kind of Palestinian violence is nothing but resistance toward the evil, powerful person. So that's more justified than they're deciding. We can get lost in secular categories. I just wonder, would Jesus frame it this way? Yeah, I'll let you.
Totally. Yeah. So, Jesus lived in an occupied context as well. The Roman Empire militarily controlled that region. And so there were military governments, and soldiers, and those trappings were a part of the world that he moved in, and he sometimes ignored it. He was interested in the kingdom of God and inviting people into this kingdom of God, and to express, what does it mean that it's a small seed that's being planted now that's going to grow and get bigger. Really challenged the kind of political assumptions of his disciples, who thought that he would come and be a convincing critic of the Roman Empire, and that he would lead them in rebellion against the Roman Empire. Like, all that stuff was kind of disappointing to them. That wasn't actually his goal. So on one level, I think, as followers of that Lord that kind of confounds our expectations, we should, like, it doesn't matter. People are deeply valued by God, and they should be deeply valued by us, whether they're Roman soldiers or Samaritan women. So on that level, it doesn't matter. I will say, if you are interested in peace and peacemaking, then being able to understand the dynamics of unequal power is important. So on another level, I think for people who really are serious and want to kind of be part of the solution, being able to recognize what power does and unequal power in different scenarios is really important. Just let me give you one example. That's coming from a researcher on terrorism. Audrey Cronin has written extensively on this, and her book is one of her books is called "How Terrorism Ends." And she just asked this research question. It's a deeply Christian question in my mind. How does terrorism end? If we're really interested in peace and peacemaking, we should be able to ask questions like that and then follow the data. That's a really Christian research agenda, I would say. And what she found is that forceful repression of these kinds of movements rarely works.
Right.
It doesn't end these kinds of movements. In fact, sometimes it gives more fuel to the fire. She's got probably 6 or 7 different things that do factors that she sees at play in ending terroristic movements, and so many of those factors relate to understanding the kind of underlying reasons why people would consider taking up arms and addressing those reasons. So like a structural approach that recognizes the role of power. So on that level, I would say it's critical to recognize that kind of stuff.
Yeah. That's what a lot of people got upset when people responded to kind of the moral clarity response to October 7th. This is black and white, good and evil, to say, well, this was an evil act and profoundly so. But this isn't the first inning. This is the 8th inning of a very long baseball game, and to not understand the context leading up to this won't do anything to help us make choices that will prevent something like this from happening again. But people you mentioned context, and people think you're a Hamas supporter.
Right. No, really, what I'm in favor is of recognizing reality, a wider, more complex reality than our reduced mythology allows for.
Yeah, Ben, I can't wait to have you at Exiles. We haven't even talked about this, Ben, and your team, right? You're going to be leading one of the breakouts at Exiles.
That's right. Yep.
Give us a little, chum to waters. What are you going to be talking about there?
So we're going to be talking about how American evangelicals have engaged with and responded to Gaza as a crisis of discipleship. So we're going to talk about it's kind of like what we've been doing. We're talking about our own response to what's been happening over there as something itself that needs to be paid close attention to. And Munther Ishak is going to be with me in that breakout, as well as Sung Chan Ra. So that's going to be a really rich conversation. And then can I make a couple of other invitations as well?
Sure. Yeah.
Awesome. So NEME is collaborating with a whole network of evangelical organizations to bring a major conference on Israel and Palestine to Chicagoland, September 11, 12, and 13. And we would love for anyone who wants to dig more deeply into this to join us there. It's called Church at the Crossroads. And the website's not up yet, but it's going to be churchatthecrossroads.com. So in a few weeks, invite people to go check that out. And then
I've already blacked it out. I'm going to be there.
You're going to be there. Yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, 100%. I've been talking to Daniel about it. So
gotcha.
No, I've already blocked it out on my calendar.
That's great.
Yeah.
And then the Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East has resources too that we invite folks to engage with. We have a curriculum that just launched a few months ago for individuals, churches, small groups, homeschool groups to dig more deeply into this. It introduces key history. It introduces, like who are the Christians of the land, who are the Jews of the land, who are the Muslims of the land, and then turns towards some of these, some of the political context and the conflict. And then we also have recommended resources for people who want to learn. One of the things that I ask, especially, if the myth, the narrative, the template that I read earlier is the one that all of your media choices, your favorite podcasters and whatnot, adhere to that one, expand your sources, just read more widely. And you can go to our website, NEME.network, NEME.network/resources. And we've got, everything from kind of Christian Zionist articulations all the way to more progressive. And, we put it all out there for you to look at and consider.
Yeah, that's great, man. Yeah, it is. you have to read beyond kind of just your traditional, whatever you want to call it, legacy media, mainstream media. And there's so much really good independent journalism out there, an explosion, obviously, of podcasts and stuff. And once you, get beyond kind of the mainstream media outlets, which again are there's financial incentives for telling a certain narrative that lie behind a lot of these places. And once you go to independent outlets, it's you just start getting a whole different picture.
I've been listening to a lot of Breaking Points ever since you mentioned it to me
they're great.
a few months ago.
Breaking Points. There's Drop Site News. They do a lot of stuff.
That's right.
There's some that are a little more activist and are definitely one-sided. Now, I agree with a lot of what they're saying, and I cross-check it with more, maybe less activist-y sites, places like the Gray Zone, Max Blumenthal, and who's made this kind of his life mission, and others. Yeah, there's so much out there, and podcasts, and yeah. Well, man, I'm excited to see you next month in Minneapolis, April 3rd to 5th. Exiles, you guys, still some tickets available. If you can't make it out to Minneapolis, you can stream it virtually as well. So, Ben, thank you so much for your heart and the work you're doing, and thanks for being a guest on Theology in a Raw.
Thanks, Preston, and I'll just encourage your listeners, ask who are your Samaritan women, and let's go find them.
This show is part of the Converge Podcast Network.